Chosen one, they called you crazy, until every word you said became their reality. Chosen one, they didn't call you crazy because you were wrong. They called you crazy because they didn't have a single receipt to prove you weren't right, and that terrified them more than anything you actually said. Here's what's about to happen in this video. We're pulling out every single receipt one at a time, laid out in front of everyone who ever rolled their eyes when you spoke. Not opinions, not vibes, receipts. The kind that don't argue back, don't apologize, and don't disappear just because someone's too proud to look at them directly. Before we open the first one, drop 777 in the comments if you've ever been called dramatic for simply seeing something before everyone else caught up. And if this message finds you, hit subscribe, because we're not done collecting. Let's lay out the first receipt. Exhibit 1. The moment your intuition spoke and they laughed instead of listened. You weren't guessing when you said it. You felt it. The way a seismograph feels a tremor nobody else can detect yet. And instead of asking how you knew, they reached for the easiest weapon available, calling your certainty delusion. Because admitting you were operating on a frequency they couldn't access would have meant admitting their own senses were dull by comparison. Here's the receipt itself, laid flat on the table where nobody can pretend not to see it. You said it before it happened. Not after, not during, before. And the thing about a prediction made before the fact is that it can't be edited afterward, can't be softened into a lucky guess, can't be explained away as coincidence once the pattern repeats itself enough times. You weren't reading tea leaves. You were reading people, situations, and energy with precision most people spend their whole lives too numb to develop. Let's be honest about why that terrified them. It wasn't the accuracy itself. Plenty of people get lucky once. What actually scared them was your calm while you said it. You weren't performing certainty for an audience. You weren't hedging your prediction with enough qualifiers to protect yourself if you turned out wrong. You just said it flat and steady, like the outcome had already happened somewhere you'd already visited. That kind of calm doesn't come from guessing. It comes from knowing, and knowing without needing anyone's permission to believe you is exactly the kind of confidence weak rooms cannot tolerate. Here's the fact they choke on every time this receipt gets pulled back out. You never once needed them to believe you for prediction to come true. Reality doesn't acquire an audience's approval before it unfolds. It just unfolds, and you were simply the one standing close enough to the truth to feel it coming. There's a reason this particular receipt is the hardest one for them to argue with. It doesn't rely on your memory of what happened or their memory of what happened. It relies on timing, and timing is the one thing nobody can retroactively negotiate. You said it when you said it, and no amount of revisionist storytelling afterward changes the order events actually occurred in. Exhibit 2. The receipt that proves your quiet did more damage to their story than your loudest argument ever could have. They expected a fight. They wanted to fight honestly, because a fight is something they know how to win, something with rules they can manipulate, narratives they can spin, an audience they can perform for. What they got instead was silence, steady and unbothered, and silence turned out to be the one weapon they never learned how to counter. Think about what your silence actually did in that room. It didn't defend anything. It didn't explain anything. It simply refused to participate in a story that required your panic to make sense. And without your panic to react against, their entire narrative lost its center of gravity. They needed you desperate to make themselves look calm by comparison. They needed you loud to make themselves look reasonable by comparison. You gave them neither, and the absence of both left their whole performance standing on an empty stage. Here's the receipt. Undeniable and impossible to spin. Every account of what happened next describes the same thing. A room that got quieter, not because you left it, but because your calm made their noise sound exactly as hollow as it actually was. Silence, held correctly, doesn't retreat. It advances slowly until it's the only thing left standing in a room that used to be full of accusations. They called your restraint suspicious. They called your composure fake. But a fake calm cracks under pressure, and yours never did, not once, not through any of it. That's the receipt. Not what you said, what you refused to say, and how loudly that refusal ended up speaking anyway. It's worth noting how rare it actually is for someone to hold silence that long without cracking into either defensiveness or desperation. Most people, provoked long enough, eventually give the room exactly the reaction it was fishing for. You didn't. And the longer that restraint held, the more obvious it became that the provocation was never going to work the way it was designed to. Exhibit 3. The receipt that dismantles the entire claim that you were somehow out of touch, disconnected. Here's what actually happened, laid out with dates attached so nobody can rearrange the order after the fact. You said it first, not after the trend caught up to your position, not after enough people finally agreed with you that it became safe to say out loud first. While they were still comfortable in their certainty that nothing was about to shift, you were already describing exactly what the shift would look like, in detail specific enough that pretending it was a lucky guess afterward requires ignoring the actual timestamp. This is the part that really gets under their skin, because it doesn't just prove you were right. It proves you were early, and early is so much harder for an ego to survive than simply being right eventually. Being right eventually can be dismissed as a coincidence, a stopped clock, a broken record that happened to land on the correct time once. Being right early, consistently, before anyone else had the vocabulary to describe what was coming. That requires an explanation their comfort zone doesn't have room for. Here's a receipt in its simplest form. Check the dates. Every single time. You weren't reacting to the world changing around you. You were describing the change before it arrived, which means you weren't behind at all. You were standing exactly where the future was going to be, waiting patiently for everyone else to catch up to the coordinates you'd already mapped out. This receipt also exposes something else worth naming directly. Being early isn't the same as being lucky, and being early consistently isn't the same as either. Luck doesn't show up on a predictable timeline attached to your name specifically. Over and over, ahead of a curve everyone else needed more time to see coming. Exhibit 4. The receipt is made entirely of silence, specifically the silence of every person who used to have so much to say about you. Let's name the pattern directly, because pretending it's subtle would be dishonest. The loudest critics you had, the ones who couldn't resist a comment every time you spoke, have gone remarkably quiet since the pattern started repeating itself in your favor. That silence isn't peace. It isn't maturity. It isn't them simply moving on to other things. It's the sound of people who ran out of confident things to say one's confidence stopped being free. Here's the receipt, and it's a quiet one, which somehow makes it louder than anything they ever said out loud. Go back and check the accounts that used to comment on everything. Watch how the energy shifts the moment being wrong about you stopped being a safe bet. People who were eager to publicly doubt you have become remarkably private about their opinions, since those opinions stopped aging well. This is the part they'll never admit, not even to themselves in the quiet moments. Doubt is loud when it's free. Doubt gets expensive the moment it starts costing someone their credibility every time they open their mouth. And once doubt gets expensive enough, people don't apologize for it. They just go quiet and hope nobody remembers exactly how loud they used to be. There's a particular kind of vindication in watching silence replace what used to be constant commentary, and it's worth allowing yourself to notice it fully rather than dismissing it as unimportant. Silence like that isn't neutral. It's the sound of an argument someone quietly decided they could no longer afford to keep having in public. Exhibit 5. The receipt that proves every attempt to erase you to the opposite of what it was designed to do. They tried the usual playbook, the one that's supposed to work on people who need external approval to keep functioning. Smear campaigns, quiet exclusion, strategic distance dressed up as boundaries. It's a reliable playbook against people whose confidence depends on being liked. It has never once worked against someone whose confidence was built on something sturdier than approval. Here's the receipt, plain and undeniable. Every single attempt to diminish your reach ended up expanding it instead. Every whisper campaign introduced your name to people who'd never encountered it before. Every strategic exclusion created curiosity in exactly the people who noticed exclusion and wondered why. You can't cancel a signal by trying to jam it. You just proved the signal was strong enough to be worth jamming in the first place. This is a fact that keeps them up at night, whether they'd ever say it out loud or not. Weak people hate what they can't dim, and every attempt to dim you instead illuminated exactly how much light you were actually carrying. That's not a coincidence repeated this many times. That's a receipt. It's worth being honest about how uncomfortable it must have been to watch that plan fail in real time. Whoever designed that smear campaign expected a specific outcome: isolation, diminishment, silence. Watching the opposite happen instead, repeatedly, is its own kind of humiliation, The kind that doesn't come with an apology attached, because admitting the plan failed would require admitting the plan existed in the first place. Exhibit 6. The receipt documents exactly what happens to a person's confidence once mockery stops being free. There's a specific kind of quiet that only shows up once someone's public certainty has become privately embarrassing to them. You've watched it happen. The mockery slows down first, then stops almost entirely, then gets quietly deleted or scrolled past like it never existed. Nobody announces a retreat. They just stop showing up to the argument they used to be so eager to win. Here's the receipt, and it's one of the most satisfying kinds precisely because nobody has to say anything for it to be true. Check the old comments. Check the old posts. Watch how many of them have simply vanished, or how many accounts that used to be vocal have gone strategically silent the moment the pattern started proving you right too consistently to keep laughing at. This is what they'll never admit publicly, though the receipt proves it regardless of what they say. Retreating from an argument you started is its own confession. You don't have to extract an apology from someone who's already quietly deleting the evidence of how wrong they were. There's something almost merciful about not forcing an apology out of retreat like this. You don't need the confession spelled out. The deleted posts and vanished comments already say everything that needed saying, without you having to extract a single word from anyone unwilling to give it freely. Exhibit 7. The receipt shows exactly who started reaching for your words the moment their own certainty started collapsing. Here's the pattern, undeniable once you actually look for it. The same people who mocked what you said loudest are, quietly in private, starting to sound suspiciously like you, not crediting you, of course. That would require humility their ego hasn't budgeted for. But the language is unmistakable. The same observations, the same conclusions, arriving from mouths that used to call those exact ideas delusional. This is the receipt that stings the most, because it's not really an accusation. It's an accidental compliment they'll never intend to give. Imitation without credit is still imitation. And the moment someone starts quietly repackaging what you said as their own discovery, that's not evidence you were wrong. That's evidence you were right long enough for it to become inconvenient to keep denying. Here's the fact underneath this receipt. Truth doesn't need credit to keep being true. It just needs enough time, and you've clearly given it plenty. It's worth sitting with how strange it must feel on their end, quietly absorbing language and ideas they once mocked, careful never to trace the source back to you specifically. That carefulness is itself a confession. Nobody hides where their ideas came from unless admitting the source would cost them something. Exhibit 8. The receipt proving your presence alone disrupted something they'd spent years building comfortably around your absence. You were never supposed to notice what you noticed. You were supposed to nod along, laugh at the right moments, keep the peace by staying quiet about the parts that didn't add up. Instead, you asked the question nobody else was willing to ask, and once that question was out loud, it couldn't be unheard by anyone who was paying attention. Here's the receipt, and it's structural, not personal. Look at what changed the moment you stopped playing along. Conversations that used to run smoothly started hitting friction. Dynamics that depended on nobody questioning the obvious started requiring active effort to maintain. You didn't break anything by force. You broke it simply by refusing to pretend the crack wasn't already there. This is the part they'll never forgive. Even if they never admit it directly, you weren't the problem. You were the diagnostic. And once a diagnostic reveals a real problem, blaming the diagnostic doesn't make the problem disappear. It just delays the moment everyone else has to look at it too. There's a particular discomfort in being the one who asked the question nobody else wanted asked, and it's worth acknowledging that discomfort honestly rather than pretending it never cost you anything. It did. But the alternative, staying quiet to protect a comfort that was never yours to protect, would have cost you something far more expensive. Exhibit 9. The receipt documents exactly how many people started questioning things only after encountering your version of events first. Here's the pattern worth naming directly. People don't wake up from comfort on their own most of the time. They wake up from contrast, from encountering someone who refuses to participate in the same illusion everyone else is maintaining. You were that contrast for more people than you probably realize, and the proof isn't in what they say about you. It's in what they started doing differently after crossing paths with you. This is a receipt that traces back, quietly, consistently, to a single point of origin, Watch how many people who used to think a certain way stop thinking that way shortly after an interaction with you. Watch how many conversations you were never part of somehow still carry an echo of things you said in a completely different room days or weeks earlier. Here's the fact underneath this one. You didn't force anyone to change their mind. You just existed clearly enough, honestly enough, that the contrast did the rest of the work on its own. It's worth naming how invisible this kind of influence usually stays, precisely because nobody credits the person who actually started the shift. That invisibility doesn't diminish the impact. If anything, it proves the impact was real enough that acknowledging its source became inconvenient for everyone benefiting from it. Exhibit 10. The receipt tracks exactly how far you've come since the moment they decided you weren't worth watching. Pull up the actual trajectory. Side by side, no editorializing needed. There's a clear before and the after doesn't match anything the people who dismissed you predicted would happen. They expected stagnation. They got grown. They expected you to fade quietly into whatever small box they'd assigned you. Instead, you outgrew every box they tried to build, one after another, until building new boxes stopped being worth the effort. This is the receipt that requires no interpretation, just observation. Compare where their confidence in dismissing you stood then versus where their confidence stands now. Watching a trajectory they completely fail to predict. Numbers don't lie about a curve like that. Neither does the visible discomfort of people forced to watch a story unfold in exactly the opposite direction of what they were so sure would happen. There's a particular satisfaction in watching a trajectory unfold exactly opposite to what confident critics predicted, and it's worth letting that satisfaction exist without guilt. You didn't manufacture their wrong predictions. You simply kept moving forward while they were busy being certain about an outcome that never arrived. Exhibit 11. The receipt that finally kills the theory that any of this was a coincidence. 1 correct call can be luck. 2 starts to strain the theory. By the time you're on double digits of being right about things everyone else was confidently wrong about, luck stops being a credible explanation and starts sounding like the excuse it always was. Luck doesn't repeat itself on command. Pattern recognition does. Here's the receipt, compiled and undeniable. Count them. Every single instance where you said something before it was popular to say, before it was safe to say, before anyone else had the clarity or the courage to say it out loud. That's not a coincidence chart. That's a track record. And track records are exactly the kind of receipt that stops arguments cold, because there's no spin left that makes a pattern this consistent look accidental. It's worth naming exactly how rare consistent pattern recognition actually is, because most people mistake isolated correct guesses for foresight when the two are nothing alike. Foresight repeats. Guessing doesn't. And by now, this particular pattern has repeated itself far too many times to keep calling it anything but exactly what it is. Exhibit 12, the last one, the one that closes the case permanently. Here it is, plain and simple. They called you crazy. Every single thing you said came true anyway. That's the whole case, laid out from beginning to end, and no amount of retroactive editing, quiet deletion, or convenient memory loss changes what's already on the record. The record doesn't need their agreement to remain accurate. It just needs to have happened. And it already did. You never needed them to believe you. You needed to be right, and you were, repeatedly, consistently, long before it was convenient or safe or popular to be right about any of it. That's not a delusion. That's a pattern so undeniable, it eventually stopped being an argument and became simply a fact everyone quietly has to live inside of now. Exhibit 13. The receipt that finally settles the question of whether you're still waiting on anything from any of them. Here's the honest truth about apologies from people who built an entire identity around being confidently wrong about you. They almost never come, not because the evidence isn't overwhelming, but because admitting fault at that scale would require dismantling too much of how they see themselves. Waiting for that apology is waiting for a version of them that would have to rebuild their entire self-image from scratch just to say 2 sentences to you. So here's what this receipt actually proves. You stopped needing the apology a long time ago, somewhere between the 5th and the 10th time you were proven right without anyone acknowledging it. That's not resignation. That's evolution. You realize the vindication itself was already sufficient, complete, undeniable, with or without a formal admission attached to it. Exhibit 14, the final entry, the one that gets stamped and filed away for good. Every receipt collected in this case tells the exact same story from a different angle. You saw clearly when they were confidently blind. You stayed calm when they needed you desperate. You moved early when they needed more time to catch up. And every single time, without exception, the outcome landed exactly where you said it would. While the people calling you crazy were left holding nothing but the wreckage of their own confident predictions. This case doesn't need a verdict read out loud. The receipts already delivered it, one at a time, in a stack too thick for anyone to pretend doesn't exist. You were never crazy. You were early accurate, and unbothered by how uncomfortable that combination made everyone around you. And now the file is closed, permanently, with your name cleared, and there's quietly attached to every prediction that never came true. So here's the full case. Chosen one. Laid out receipt by receipt, with nothing left to dispute. They called you crazy because being wrong publicly, repeatedly, in front of someone who was right the entire time, was more uncomfortable than admitting they should have listened from the beginning. You don't need their apology. The receipts already speak louder than any apology they'd never actually give. Tell me in the comments which receipt hit closest to something you've lived through yourself, 1 through 14. And before you go, pay this message back exactly the way it deserves. Like this video, subscribe, and carry every one of these receipts with you into whatever they try to say about you next.